Welcome. This is a series about Dhea Loral. This first one is going to focus on world building, so find out how the Realm of Dhea Loral came about. When I was still a teenager, and my brother and I were deciding to get into role-playing games and showing our interest in fantasy, and of course I wanted to build a world that we could play those games in before we even really had rule books. We're kind of making our own rules. Classic epic fantasy setting. Building a fantasy world for our gaming. Um, I did have a number of problems with what I considered that epic fantasy and some of the elements of it that I saw in movies and read in books at the time, a variety of sources that I drew from. Four of the biggest problems were uh, interference from the deities, the gods, if they were present. I felt that took away from the heroes. Another one was, okay, why are there so many ruins and dungeons, scattered about, just there for the taking? Another concern was a mix of the weapon and armor technologies that might have been available that not so historically accurate. And another thing was just about, I've seen a number of things fantasy that tried to make, great story and said, hey, we're fantasy. But I felt that the good story was kind of lacking or taking a back seat to just, the fantasy. Let's just say also there were movies and shows that were based off of something that would normally be popular in the fantasy realm and fantasy market, but the official adaptation of whatever movie or TV series I felt was lacking. Like they're like, okay, here we are in this famous fantasy world, but the story or something just wasn't there. Now of the first point, deity interference, and how sometimes I felt it gave the mortal heroes of the book a back seat in a way. And usually, a lot of them were too heavy-handed about this, but still, like one thing I can think about, the classic movie, the original Clash of the Titans. There's a part where Perseus collapses and can't go on with his quest, and Zeus, looking above when the other gods aren't looking, reaches down and kind of picks him up and gets him back on the path. And much as I love the movie, I felt things like that kind of take the focus away from these mortal heroes and put it too much on the gods. And it's like, why don't these gods interfere even more? A book series that I do love, the Dragonlance Chronicle series, that was one of the first by TSR to put their Dungeons and Dragons characters into a book. Anyways, Dragons of Autumn Twilight. Like I say, love the book, love that series. It was more subtle in how it did it. The gods were playing their games, and even though the focus was on the mortal heroes, the gods were quite present and quite involved. It was very subtle, but the gods were still there. If the gods can interfere in any way they like, and they're struggling with each other, why, what's holding them back? Yeah, it just occurs to me, if the gods can interfere so much, what's holding them back? Especially if they're struggling with each other. I mean, we're talking gods compared to mortals. What are mortals going to do? One of the reasons behind Dhea Loral is, okay, let's say they did. Let's say the gods did interfere, and they really messed up the world. And they even realized, hey, we can't do this anymore. And they even bound themselves out of the mortal realm. So in Dhea Loral, you had a gods' wars, which tore apart everything, nearly, may have wiped out some races, brought others to their knees. And so finally, you have the gods getting together and locking themselves out of the realm. And that's not to say, though, that they still don't have their ambitions. And so, as most of these stories in Dhea Loral pick up, enough time has passed that people are recovered, they're exploring again. Uh, it's life is not so much a struggle. And that's where an influence from my childhood comes in. There is a Cold War going on. I grew up in a Cold War between, US and Russia. When it's like we're not trying to go to war, but we're working against each other. And that's what the gods are doing. But they have forbidden themselves. They can't go into the realms. So they have to rely on mortals, moving mortals to do their deeds, to do their will, and carry out their war. So I think that was, to me, a big thing that fuels Dhea Loral, and it's explored quite thoroughly in my first trilogy, the Earth and Stones series, where you've got people that finding out they're players in a bigger game, and that the covenant which barred the gods out of the world might even be at risk. So on to the second point, the reason for ruins and dungeons scattered about all over the world. You think a lot of them would have been picked over by now. In some case, that would be true. But by having a great age where we were once at before the Gods Wars leveled everything, and everyone was struggling for survival, it does leave a lot of the maps no longer accurate. There were continents sundered. There are new islands that rose up from the cataclysms. The maps are incomplete. And now that people are finally, life's not such a struggle, they're starting to expand. Most cases they're still formed around these city-states or governments that are still composed of city-states, but they're even within their borders, their territory, it's rather lawless. You can still find all sorts of ruins and dungeons out there that haven't really been touched or have become the home of something else that's been trying to survive all this time. And I felt that was a big thing that kind of lends credence to, yes, why are there ruins and dungeons and places to explore all over? Even in my books, the city of Orlan, also known as Sprawling Towers, it's said that the approach to Orlan by sea, its harbor, you need a harbor master. It's a little difficult. Why? Because there were sections of the city that went under the water. There's places outside their harbor where those old towers are still sticking up out of the water. That leads to maybe an underwater exploration for adventurers, which helps for my books, but it helped back when Dhea Loral was a role-playing world as well. Now the third point, the weapon and armor technologies. I've noticed a lot of cases in which people would kind of mix weapon and armor of what was historically different time periods. And some cases even in world history that can apply, where technologically better nation runs across one that's not so advanced. But in most cases, you typically see weapons and armor through history go through a natural progression together. It's an arms and armor race, and it takes specific steps. It kind of stays in line historically. Now in a fantasy world, they already give you some leeway to mix this up, because think about it, even if you were a Renaissance age technology where you have muskets, and of course since you have muskets, there's no sense in using armor, so people are focused more on the rapier and stuff like that. You could still have a big troll menace the town. And then you better have a big axe or a big sword and some armored guys ready to deal with that. So fantasy allows some mix of weapon and armor technology to kind of coexist. After all, you also have magic. Maybe more people would be dressed armored than that because of the nearby ogre population or something, but yet you've got enough wizards and magic users walking around that, that armor is just going to impede you. So you might go without. But fantasy doesn't totally excuse that approach either. And that's why I also thought with the Gods Wars kind of resetting things. We were at a golden age. People were highly advanced. Didn't matter what race. Different races, different peoples were highly advanced in some of their weapons and armor. And now all of a sudden things are reset with the Gods Wars. Some technology, some knowledge was lost. People were scattered. And then it makes sense that some people recovered at a different pace. Widow's Brigade, right there, that's right above me. That's kind of a situation too, where there's different technologies of two people that are living nearby each other. The dwarves actually have muskets and guns. The dwarves of those mountains, and their nearest neighbor is the warlike humans of the country Tyrika, the Trican Empire. And well, the Tricans don't have that technology, but they've lived close enough with the dwarves. You think maybe over time they would have picked it up. I had to put a reason in, and I found a reason, and I don't fully explain it in the Widow Brigade because there's not really the opportunity to see things from the human's point of view. But they revere those muskets and that black powder and all that as evil dwarven magic. Here the dwarves try very hard not to lose their muskets to the Tricans, and they think they're doing a good job of it. These guys haven't acquired our technology. The fact is, Tricans have acquired muskets from dead or captured dwarves in the past, but they consider it evil and they actually destroy them. Dwarves just haven't caught on and figured this out yet because the communication isn't there. So my last point is about making good stories in a fantasy world. And I've seen some good stories. I've seen some good stories based on the rules of the fantasy world. And yet I felt like even when you write something, an experience is better written if you have a life experience which is comparable to it as well. A lot of my characters might go through some real life, this earth world emotions, experiences, and situations which drive, which affect their emotions and their state of mind. It just happens to be set in a fantasy world. There was even I remember a scene, something about maybe it was George Lucas, and he was talking about Star Wars, and he says, sometimes you are going to lose yourself in the scene, lose yourself in the science fiction that he had up on the screen, but he said that should never take place over the story. And that's how I try to write Dhea Loral. When we go into the Earthrend Stone series, and we're mostly focusing on Tristan in that first book, he is, he's just coming into adulthood, and he's thrust into something where he's making some major decisions of his life, and there's something that's vexing him, and he's unsure whether he can take the step forward or not. In Widow Brigade, Dooley doesn't set out to be a hero. In fact, many people have talked about how, she's not really the hero, she's not really the anti-hero, she just feels real. Dooley is going through a crisis, and she's trying to find a response to it that isn't allowed by her people. And it causes a revolution, not because Dooley wants to cause a revolution, she's just trying to solve her own problems. And with Pilgrims and Blades coming out, all these characters, all of them, have a life mystery, a life quest. And they will be exploring that together over time. So that's always been an important thing. In Dhea Loral, the stories have to trump the fantasy world. Thanks again for joining me. This is the About Dhea Loral series focused on world building. Tune in and check out some of the other About Dhea Loral, in which I can tell you more about my world. Thank you again for your likes and shares on social media. And if you like the books, I love those good reviews on Amazon and Goodreads. Thank you.